On a warm summer evening on Seymour Avenue, the air felt familiar and safe. Smoke from a backyard grill drifted lazily over low wooden fences, carrying the smell of charcoal and seasoned meat. Neighbors stood just a few feet apart, paper plates in hand, laughing about work, sports, and the small annoyances of everyday life. Music played softly from an open window. Somewhere down the street, a car passed, tires humming over cracked pavement. It was the kind of scene that blends into memory, a normal night on a normal street, the kind you don't think twice about because nothing feels wrong. Behind one of those fences stood a house that looked exactly like the others. Same shape, same worn siding, same front steps. The man hosting the barbecue was just another neighbor. He smiled, he talked, he belonged. No alarms went off. No one felt afraid. Life moved forward in small, ordinary moments measured in conversations and casual waves. But inside that house, only a few feet away from the laughter and the grill, 3 women were imprisoned. While food cooked and jokes landed, while neighbors leaned against fences and children passed by on bicycles, those women were trapped behind locked doors, not in a remote cabin, not buried underground, but in a house pressed tightly against other homes, on a street full of people. For nearly 10 years, 2 realities existed at the same address, one loud and social, the other silent and unseen. And that's where this story becomes truly unsettling, because the horror didn't hide in darkness or distance. It lived right next door. How can something like this exist so close to normal life? How can years of suffering unfold within earshot of casual conversation, clinking dishes, and friendly laughter? We're taught to believe that evil announces itself, that it looks suspicious, acts strange, stands apart. But what if it doesn't? What if it blends in so well that it becomes invisible? The man who lived in that house didn't isolate himself from the world. He didn't avoid people. He invited them in, at least to his backyard. He shook hands. He shared food. He became part of the background of the neighborhood. And in doing so, he created the perfect disguise: familiarity. This is the fear at the center of the Seymour Avenue case. Not just what happened inside the house, but where it happened. Because this wasn't a story of a monster hiding far away. This was a story of a neighbor. Someone you might nod to in passing. Someone you might trust simply because they were there every day. How does someone live a double life like that for 10 years? How do they move between laughter and cruelty, between public normalcy and private horror, without the 2 worlds colliding? And just as disturbing, how does a neighborhood unknowingly become part of the cover? This isn't a story meant to shock with violence. It's meant to unsettle with proximity. Because once you understand what happened on Seymour Avenue, it leaves you with a quiet, uncomfortable question that lingers long after the smoke clears and the laughter fades. If it could happen there, so openly, so close, how sure are we about what's happening next door? Seymour Avenue was not a forgotten place. It wasn't a ghost town, and it wasn't cut off from the rest of the city. It was a real neighborhood, the kind built on routine. Houses stood close together, separated by narrow driveways and aging fences. Front porches faced the street. People came and went for work, for school, for errands. Sirens passed through from time to time. Music spilled from open windows in the summer. This was a lived-in street, shaped by years of ordinary life, not the kind of place where you expect something unspeakable to hide. That's exactly why this case continues to unsettle people more than so many others. When crimes happen in abandoned buildings or isolated areas, the distance creates a kind of emotional safety. We tell ourselves those places are different. But Seymour Avenue wasn't different. It looked like countless streets across the country. You could stand on the sidewalk and see neighbors talking, children walking by, cars parked bumper to bumper. Nothing about it warned you to be afraid. And that normalcy is what makes the truth so disturbing. This story doesn't haunt people because of graphic details. It haunts them because of how long it lasted, how close it was, and how easily it blended into everyday life. For nearly a decade, something horrific existed inside a house that shared walls of sound and space with others. And yet the neighborhood kept moving forward, day after day, unaware of what was happening just beyond locked doors. That's the angle of this story. This is not a video about gore, shock value, or sensationalism. There are no graphic scenes here, because they aren't necessary to understand the horror. The real terror lives in silence, in routine, in the way suffering can hide behind normal schedules, familiar faces, and the assumption that what we don't see isn't happening. This is a story about proximity, the unsettling truth that horror doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it hides in plain sight, and sometimes it lives so close that we brush past it without ever knowing. Over the course of this video, we're going to examine several layers of that reality. We'll look at the house itself, not as a crime scene, but as a physical boundary between two worlds. One visible, social, and ordinary. The other closed off, controlled, and unseen. We'll talk about the neighborhood and how dense, noisy, and familiar environments can unintentionally conceal suffering rather than expose it. We'll also explore the double life that made all of this possible. How someone can move between being a neighbor and something far darker, and how consistency and routine can become tools that deflect suspicion instead of raising it. And finally, we'll confront the question that lingers over every part of this case, the question neighbors, investigators, and viewers all ask in different ways. How did no one know? Not to assign blame, but to understand something far more uncomfortable. Because this case isn't just about one house on Seymour Avenue. It's about how easily we trust normalcy, how often we explain away what feels wrong, and how the most frightening things don't always happen in places we expect. By the end of this story, Seymour Avenue won't feel like a distant headline. It will feel uncomfortably familiar. Seymour Avenue looked like hundreds of other streets woven through American cities. Modest houses lined both sides of the road, built close enough that you could hear a neighbor's door open or a television flick on through an open window. Narrow driveways cut between homes. Fences marked property lines, but they were low and imperfect wooden slats. Chain links, things meant more for boundaries than privacy. From the sidewalk, you could see front porches with worn steps, small patches of grass, and mailboxes leaned slightly from age. Nothing about the street suggested secrecy. Everything about it suggested life. Daily routines gave the avenue its rhythm. In the mornings, people left for work, engines starting one after another, doors shutting, footsteps fading down the sidewalk. During the day, the street was quieter but never silent. Delivery trucks passed through. A neighbor might step outside to smoke or water plants. Music drifted faintly from a radio. In the evenings, the street came alive again. Cars returning, voices rising, televisions glowing behind curtains. On weekends, there were gatherings, repairs, conversations shouted across fences. It was a place where people lived close enough to be aware of one another without actually knowing much at all. That closeness is important. The houses weren't separated by distance or land. They were separated by walls thin ones. Sound traveled easily. Arguments, laughter, barking dogs, slammed doors, all of it blended together into a constant background hum. Seymour Avenue was never truly quiet, and because of that, noise stopped meaning danger. Noise meant normal. Shared fences created a strange balance between familiarity and privacy. You could see your neighbor's backyard from certain angles. You could smell their cooking. You could hear conversations without catching full words. But there was also an unspoken rule. What happens inside a house is not your concern. Doors closed, curtains drawn, and life went on. People respected boundaries not because they were enforced, but because they were expected. This is how normal becomes a shield. When everything looks ordinary, nothing feels urgent. A house that looks like every other house doesn't raise questions. A man who follows routines doesn't attract attention. Familiarity dulls suspicion. Over time, the street teaches you what to ignore. You stop reacting to raised voices. You stop noticing slammed doors. You stop wondering about strange sounds because strange sounds are everywhere. The human mind looks for patterns, and when something repeats without obvious consequences, it gets filed away as harmless. On Seymour Avenue, chaos didn't stand out, it blended in. Urban and working-class neighborhoods are loud by nature. Traffic, sirens, arguments, music, celebrations, frustrations, these are part of the environment. Noise doesn't signal danger. It signals life. And when noise is constant, silence is what feels unusual. A house that never makes a sound might raise concern. A house that sounds like every other house does not. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths of the case. Suffering doesn't always hide in silence. Sometimes it hides behind volume. Sometimes it hides behind the constant motion of everyday life, where no single sound lasts long enough to demand attention. A scream doesn't echo. It disappears into traffic. A cry blends into music. A struggle becomes indistinguishable from an argument or a television turned up too loud. Normalcy also creates emotional shortcuts. People assume that if something truly terrible were happening, someone else would notice. Someone closer, someone more responsible. Someone whose job it is to intervene. This diffusion of concern allows entire streets to unknowingly coexist with horror. No one is ignoring anything on purpose. They are simply trusting the system of normal life to catch what they miss. And Seymour Avenue felt safe because it looked safe. Children walked nearby. Neighbors talked casually. Nothing appeared abandoned or suspicious. The street had continuity. Faces became familiar. Cars were recognized. This continuity creates trust, even when that trust is unearned. We associate danger with disruption, with sudden changes, odd behavior, isolation. Seymour Avenue offered none of those warning signs. Over time, normal becomes invisible. People remember unusual moments, but they forget routine ones. 10 years can pass, not because no one cared, but because nothing broke the pattern strongly enough to force action. The street didn't stop. The houses didn't empty. Life didn't pause. And because life kept moving, suffering stayed hidden. This is why proximity is more frightening than distance. The closeness of the houses didn't expose the truth, it buried it. The shared noise didn't reveal pain, it masked it. The familiarity of the street didn't protect people, it protected the illusion that nothing was wrong. Seymour Avenue teaches a difficult lesson. Danger doesn't always isolate itself. Sometimes it embeds. Sometimes it thrives in places where people feel most comfortable. And sometimes the very things we associate with safety, routine, noise, familiarity become the perfect cover for something unthinkable happening just a few feet away. On that street, normal wasn't just a description of daily life. It was the shield that allowed horror to exist unnoticed, surrounded by people, sound, and routine hiding not in silence, but in plain sight. To the people living on Seymour Avenue, Ariel Castro was not a mystery. He was not a shadowy figure who slipped in and out at odd hours or avoided contact. He was present. He was visible. He existed in the same shared space as everyone else, and that alone shaped how he was perceived. Neighbors didn't describe him as frightening or distant. They described him as someone they recognized, someone they'd seen many times before. And recognition, more than character, often becomes the foundation of trust. Castro followed routines. He left the house. He returned. He worked. He parked his car in familiar spots. These patterns mattered more than people realize. Human beings are deeply conditioned to see routine as safety. When someone's behavior fits into the expected rhythm of a neighborhood, it signals stability. Nothing about his daily movements disrupted the flow of the street. He wasn't unpredictable, and unpredictability is usually what makes people uneasy. He talked to neighbors casually. Conversations didn't feel forced or secretive. They were the kind of exchanges people have when they live close together for long periods of time, short comments, jokes, passing observations. Sometimes they lasted only seconds, sometimes longer. There was no intensity to them, no sense that something was being hidden. And because of that, there was no reason to look closer. Castro hosted barbecues. This detail has become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case, not because of what happened at them, but because of what they symbolized. A barbecue is social by nature. It's open, relaxed, ordinary. It invites others into your space. It sends a message. I have nothing to hide. Neighbors stood in his backyard, just feet away from the house itself, eating food, laughing, and talking. In that moment, the house ceased to feel like a private mystery. It became part of a shared social environment. That's how familiarity works. The more often you see someone in normal situations, the less likely you are to associate them with harm. Visibility becomes a kind of proof of innocence. People think if something were wrong, it would show. But some people understand that appearing normal is far more effective than disappearing. Castro didn't isolate himself. He didn't behave like the version of a criminal people expect. He didn't lurk or hide or refuse interaction. He inserted himself just enough into neighborhood life to seem harmless, not charming, not exceptional, just ordinary. And ordinary people rarely raise alarms. Being seen regularly reduces suspicion because it removes mystery. Mystery invites questions. Familiarity shuts them down. Once someone becomes part of the background, they stop being examined. Their presence becomes automatic. You stop noticing details. You stop reevaluating assumptions. You stop wondering who they really are. This is one of the most uncomfortable realities of social trust. We often trust based on repetition, not evidence. Someone who shows up every day becomes known, even if we know almost nothing about them. That sense of knowing is emotional, not factual. It's built on shared space, not shared truth. Castro benefited from this deeply human shortcut. Neighbors didn't see a monster. They saw a man who fit into the neighborhood ecosystem. He didn't stand out. He didn't disrupt. He didn't challenge anyone's sense of safety. And because he didn't challenge it, it remained intact. There's also a powerful assumption at work here, that evil looks different from us. People tend to believe that those capable of extreme harm will appear visibly threatening, socially awkward, or detached. When someone laughs, cooks food, and makes conversation, they are subconsciously categorized as safe. The mind doesn't like contradictions. It resists the idea that someone can be both familiar and dangerous at the same time. Routine social interaction becomes a form of camouflage. Even small gestures reinforce this illusion. A wave, a nod, a shared laugh. These moments create microbonds that reassure us. They tell us we are among people like ourselves. And once that belief takes hold, it becomes difficult to undo. Warning signs are explained away. Doubts are softened. Discomfort is ignored. Castro didn't need people to trust him deeply. He only needed them to not question him. And familiarity accomplishes that quietly, efficiently, and over time. This is why the man next door is such a powerful and frightening idea. Not because neighbors failed, but because the system of social trust worked exactly as it usually does. People relied on what they could see, and what they could see looked normal enough. The tragedy of Seymour Avenue isn't just that a double life existed. It's that the double life didn't require deception in the traditional sense. It required consistency. It required presence. It required being just visible enough to blend in, and just ordinary enough to never be examined too closely. When the truth finally came out, neighbors weren't shocked because they'd ignored obvious signs. They were shocked because the image they built of the man next door collapsed completely. The familiarity that once felt comforting became disturbing in hindsight. Every casual interaction, every shared moment, suddenly carried a weight it never had before. And that's the most unsettling part of all. Not that he fooled people, but that he didn't really have to. From the outside, the house on Seymour Avenue was unremarkable. It didn't loom larger than the others or sink into decay. Its walls stood straight, its roof intact, its doors closed like every other home on the street. That ordinariness mattered, because houses are more than structures. They are psychological boundaries. Once a door closes, the outside world accepts a simple rule. What happens inside is private. Walls are thin, but they are powerful. They divide not just space, but responsibility. Sound may pass through them, but concern often does not. A closed door tells neighbors that whatever is happening beyond it belongs to someone else's life. It creates a mental stop sign. You don't look, you don't ask, you don't interfere. And over time, this boundary becomes absolute. Inside the house, rooms were locked, doors were shut. Space was divided intentionally, turning the interior into separate worlds. But from the outside, none of that was visible. A house is read as a single unit. People don't imagine layers within it. They don't picture sealed rooms or restricted spaces. They see one address, one family, one life. The complexity inside disappears behind siding and brick. This is how private spaces become invisible worlds. We are conditioned from childhood to respect the sanctity of homes. You knock, you wait. You don't enter unless invited. Even emotionally, we are taught not to intrude. Curiosity about someone's home is seen as rude. Suspicion is seen as paranoia. The closed door becomes a symbol of trust. We trust that what happens behind it follows the same moral rules as what happens outside. On Seymour Avenue, this assumption worked exactly as it always does. Neighbors mentally categorized the house the same way they categorized every other house. Occupied, ordinary, none of my business. Once that label is applied, it rarely changes. A home doesn't need to prove it's safe. Safety is assumed until something dramatic disrupts that belief. And disruption is rare when someone inside is actively working to maintain normal appearances outside. The concept of "not my business" is one of the strongest social forces in modern neighborhoods. It protects privacy, but it also limits intervention. People hesitate to question what they don't see clearly. They hesitate to accuse without certainty. And because the interior of a home is hidden, certainty almost never exists. Closed doors create psychological distance, even when physical distance is minimal. You can stand a few feet away from a house and still feel worlds apart from what is happening inside. That distance makes it easier to dismiss uneasy thoughts, easier to assume there's an explanation, easier to believe that if something were truly wrong, someone closer or someone official would step in. The house itself reinforced this illusion. It didn't broadcast distress. It didn't look abandoned or chaotic. It didn't invite concern. Its exterior matched the rhythm of the street. Lights turned on and off. Trash went out. Repairs were made. All the signals of normal occupancy were present. And because those signals existed, the mind filled in the rest with comforting assumptions. Locked rooms are especially powerful tools of concealment. They fragment reality inside the house while preserving simplicity outside it. From the street, there is no indication that some doors are never opened, that some spaces are inaccessible. The house appears whole, complete, safe. This fragmentation mirrors how neighbors think. They don't imagine hidden compartments of suffering. They imagine homes as unified spaces where life unfolds in familiar ways. Cooking, sleeping, watching television, living. The idea that an entirely separate reality could exist within those walls feels almost impossible until it eyes in. There is also a fear tied to crossing boundaries. Accusing someone about what happens inside their home carries social risk. Being wrong can damage relationships, reputations, and your sense of belonging. People fear being seen as intrusive more than they fear being mistaken. So doubt stays quiet. Questions go unasked. Discomfort gets buried under politeness. Closed doors don't just keep things out. They keep people from imagining what's inside. Over time, the house becomes less a place of curiosity and more a blind spot. People walk past it without really seeing it. It becomes part of the scenery, stripped of emotional weight. And once something becomes background, it becomes easy to forget it entirely. This is the cruel efficiency of domestic boundaries. They allow extreme isolation to exist in the middle of dense communities. They let suffering hide behind respect for privacy. They turn proximity into distance. On Seymour Avenue, the house didn't need secrecy in the traditional sense. It needed acceptance. Acceptance that a closed door is enough. Acceptance that walls define responsibility. Acceptance that some things are simply not our business. The psychological power of closed doors is that they don't just block entry. They block imagination. And when imagination stops, vigilance stops with it. That's how a house can sit among others for years, full of life on the outside and horror within, without ever truly being seen. The question people ask first, almost instinctively, whenever this case is mentioned, is always the same. How did nobody hear anything? It feels like the most logical place to look for answers. Sound seems undeniable. You can ignore what you don't see, but hearing feels different. Hearing feels like proof. And yet, on Seymour Avenue, sound did not expose the truth. It helped conceal it. To understand why, you have to understand how sound actually works in dense, lived-in neighborhoods. Urban noise is not occasional, it's constant. Streets hum with traffic at all hours. Sirens pass through without stopping. Music plays from houses and cars. Dogs bark. People argue, laugh, shout, and slam doors. Televisions are turned up too loud. Phones ring. Life produces noise, and the human brain adapts by filtering most of it out. This process is called normalization, and it's essential for daily functioning. If we reacted with concern to every loud or unsettling sound, we'd never feel at ease. So the brain learns what to ignore. Over time, background noise becomes invisible, not because it's quiet, but because it's familiar. On Seymour Avenue, sound blended into sound. A raised voice could be an argument. A thud could be furniture moving. A cry could be a television show, a movie, or music. In neighborhoods where houses sit close together, sound overlaps constantly. There is rarely a clean, isolated noise that clearly signals danger. Everything bleeds into everything else. And when no single sound repeats consistently enough to demand attention, it disappears into the background. There's also context. People interpret sound based on what they already believe. If you believe your neighborhood is normal, you interpret noise as normal. If you believe your neighbor is harmless, you don't imagine harm behind the noise. The mind fills in the blanks with the safest explanation available. This is why disturbing sounds are so often explained away rather than investigated. The alternative that something terrible might be happening nearby is emotionally overwhelming. It demands action. It demands confrontation. And most people are not prepared for that possibility without undeniable evidence. So instead, the brain chooses comfort. Discomfort is easier to ignore than to resolve. Hearing something unsettling creates a moment of tension, but that tension can be relieved by rationalization. It's probably nothing. Someone else would notice. If it was serious, there would be signs. These thoughts are not careless. They are protective. They allow people to continue living without constant fear. Denial doesn't always look like refusal. Sometimes it looks like explanation. There's also the social risk of being wrong. Calling attention to noise inside someone's home is not a small thing. It can strain relationships, invite conflict, and mark someone as intrusive or paranoid. Without certainty, Most people choose silence. They don't want to accuse a neighbor based on sound alone. And because sound is ambiguous, certainty rarely exists. This ambiguity is crucial. A scream heard once is alarming, but if it's never clearly repeated, it becomes questionable. Was it a scream? Was it laughter? Was it coming from the TV? The mind replays the sound, reshapes it, softens it. Memory itself becomes unreliable when filtered through fear and doubt. Sound also lacks permanence. Unlike visual evidence, it vanishes the moment it occurs. There's nothing to point to afterward. No mark, no trace. Just a feeling, and feelings are easy to dismiss. Another uncomfortable truth is that people assume suffering is loud in obvious ways. We imagine constant screaming, constant chaos, but real suffering is often fragmented. It happens in moments. It rises and falls. It's interrupted. It doesn't announce itself on a schedule. And when it appears briefly in an environment already full of noise, it gets lost. Noise, paradoxically, can be a better hiding place than silence. Silence draws attention. Silence suggests absence. Silence can feel wrong, but noise feels alive. It reassures people that life is happening as it should. A noisy house feels occupied. A noisy street feels normal. And as long as things feel normal, people relax their vigilance. There is also the belief that sound travels clearly. In reality, walls distort, muffle, and reshape noise. What starts as one thing can reach another ear as something else entirely. By the time it's heard next door, it may no longer carry its original meaning. All of this combines into a perfect storm of misunderstanding, assumption, and avoidance. The role of denial here isn't malicious, it's human. People don't want to believe that extreme harm can exist within their everyday world. Accepting that possibility changes how you see everything. It makes familiar spaces feel dangerous. It erodes the sense of safety people rely on to function. So the mind resists that conclusion until it has no other choice. On Seymour Avenue, sound didn't fail because no one cared. It failed because sound is unreliable, context-dependent, and easy to explain away when surrounded by routine and familiarity. The unsettling truth is this: hearing is not enough. Awareness requires interpretation, and interpretation is shaped by what we believe is possible. When we don't believe something terrible can happen next door, our minds will work tirelessly to make sure we don't hear it that way. That's why the question, "How did nobody hear?" has such a disturbing answer. People may have heard sounds, but hearing is not the same as understanding. And understanding requires confronting a reality most people are not prepared to face until it's too late. What allowed the horror on Seymour Avenue to last as long as it did wasn't the chaos or constant risk-taking. It was routine. Routine is one of the most powerful tools for sustaining long-term secrets because it creates predictability. And predictability creates comfort for both the person hiding the secret and for everyone around them. Human beings trust patterns. We rely on them to decide what deserves attention and what doesn't. When something happens the same way, at the same time, day after day, the brain stops actively monitoring it. It files it away as safe. This is why routines are calming and why they can be dangerous when they reuse to hide harm. On Seymour Avenue, nothing appeared to change. The house remained occupied. The same person came and went. The same rhythms continued. Trash went out. Lights turned on and off. Music played. Conversations happened. From the outside, time moved forward normally. And because there was no visible disruption, there was no trigger for suspicion. Routine sustains secrets by shrinking the space for questions. When something unusual happens once, people notice. When it happens twice, they remember. But when everything happens the same way every day, nothing feels worth questioning. Stability becomes proof. The longer a routine continues uninterrupted, the more legitimate it feels. After years, it becomes unthinkable that something hidden could exist beneath it. Predictability is also a form of control. For someone living a double life, predictability reduces risk. When movements are consistent, they don't stand out. When schedules are regular, they don't invite curiosity. Being predictable means being boring, and boring people rarely attract attention. The goal isn't to impress or dominate socially. The goal is to disappear into expectation. Castro didn't need to constantly deceive his neighbors. He didn't need elaborate lies. He needed consistency, the same face, the same behaviors, the same rhythms. Each repeated day reinforced the belief that there was nothing new to discover. Inside the house, control also relied on routine. Routine blurs time. Days lose distinction. Weeks pass without clear markers. Predictability creates psychological exhaustion. When nothing changes, hope weakens. And when hope weakens, resistance becomes harder. The outside world continues normally while the inside world feels frozen. This contrast is chilling. Movement outside, stagnation inside. For neighbors, the lack of change was reassuring. People are far more likely to notice sudden shifts, new people, strange schedules, dramatic behavior changes. But when nothing changes, concern fades. The absence of alarms becomes its own message. Everything is fine. This is where the assumption, no news is good news, becomes dangerous. In everyday life, we rely on this assumption constantly. If we don't hear about problems, we assume there are none. If no one complains, we assume nothing is wrong. Silence becomes confirmation instead of warning. And in most cases, this assumption works until it doesn't. On Seymour Avenue, no news didn't mean no suffering. It meant suffering was being contained. Predictability also creates shared blind spots. When everyone believes a situation is stable, no one feels responsible for questioning it. Concern becomes diluted across the group. Each person assumes someone else would notice first. This collective confidence becomes a shield, not for safety, but for secrecy. There's also a moral comfort in routine. When life feels predictable, people feel morally at ease. They don't want to disrupt that equilibrium with suspicion. Questioning routine feels like introducing chaos. So the mind resists it. It prefers the certainty of sameness to the uncertainty of investigation. The longer a routine holds, the harder it is to break. After years, questioning, it feels irrational. Why would something suddenly be wrong now, after all this time? That thought alone can silence doubts before they fully form. This is how long-term secrets survive in plain sight. Not through constant tension, but through the absence of it. Not through dramatic cover-ups, but through boring consistency. The double life on Seymour Avenue didn't require flawless performance. It required patience. It required understanding how people think, how neighborhoods function, and how deeply we rely on routine to tell us what's safe. And that reliance comes with a cost. Because when we assume that stability equals safety, we stop looking beneath the surface. We stop asking uncomfortable questions. We stop imagining that something terrible could be happening without disrupting the outside world. The danger of no news is good news is that it turns silence into reassurance. It trains us to accept the absence of visible problems as evidence that none exist. And in rare but devastating cases, that belief allows suffering to continue uninterrupted. On Seymour Avenue, routine didn't just maintain the illusion of normal life. It protected it. Day after day, week after week, year after year, predictability did exactly what it does best. It convinced everyone that there was nothing new to see. And when nothing appears to change, people stop looking altogether. For nearly a decade, the illusion on Seymour Avenue held. Life moved forward on familiar tracks and nothing appeared broken. Then, suddenly, it was. Not gradually, not quietly. The collapse came all at once, and when it did, it shattered more than secrecy. It shattered meaning. The moment everything changed did not arrive with a warning. There was no slow unraveling, no gentle realization. One minute, the house was just another address on the street. The next, it became something else entirely. A place that had blended into the background was thrust into the center of attention, and once seen clearly, it could never be unseen. The illusion didn't fail because it weakened. It failed because reality finally forced its way out. When the truth emerged, it spread fast. News moved through the neighborhood with a speed that felt unreal, as if the street itself was waking up from a long sleep. Police presence replaced familiarity. Tape, vehicles, and officials transformed a place of routine into a place of shock. The same sidewalks people had walked for years suddenly felt unfamiliar beneath their feet. And the most unsettling part wasn't just what was discovered, it was where it had been. The neighborhood didn't change physically. The houses stayed where they were. The fences still stood. The street looked the same, but its meaning was altered permanently. Every familiar landmark now carried a shadow. The house was no longer just a house. It was a symbol of how wrong things could be without anyone realizing. Neighbors began replaying their memories, searching for signs they might have missed. Conversations they'd once forgotten resurfaced. Sounds they'd dismissed came back with new weight. Barbecues, laughter, casual greetings, all of it felt contaminated by what they now knew had been happening at the same time. Moments that were once neutral became disturbing in hindsight. A laugh overheard through a fence. Music playing late at night. A door closing. At the time, these were meaningless details, absorbed into the noise of everyday life. But after the truth, those same details felt heavy, almost unbearable. People wondered what else was happening in those moments, what they were standing next to without knowing it. This re-examination is one of the most painful aspects of cases like this. It creates a false sense of responsibility after the fact. People ask themselves questions that have no satisfying answers. Should I have noticed something? Should I have acted differently? But those questions are born from knowledge that didn't exist at the time. Hindsight sharpens everything, even what was once invisible. The collapse of the illusion also exposed how thin it had always been. Nothing dramatic had protected the secret. No elaborate system. Just normal life continuing uninterrupted. And once that normalcy cracked, it became obvious how fragile it was. Neighbors described feeling betrayed, not just by the man who lived there, but by their own assumptions. The trust they placed in familiarity suddenly felt naive. The safety they associated with routine now felt hollow. A street that once felt predictable now felt deceptive. Ordinary spaces became charged with meaning. Backyards no longer felt purely social. Closed doors no longer felt neutral. Even silence took on a new tone. What once reassured now unsettled. This is the true impact of the moment everything shattered. It didn't just reveal a crime, it rewired perception. The neighborhood had to confront a terrifying truth, that horror had existed alongside daily life without disrupting it. That normalcy had not only failed to protect anyone, it had actively concealed harm. And that realization is deeply destabilizing, because it challenges how people understand safety itself. Afterward, Seymour Avenue was no longer just a place people lived. It became a reference point, a reminder, a warning. People elsewhere heard its name and felt a chill not because of distance, but because of similarity. Because their streets looked the same, their routines felt the same, their assumptions were the same. For the neighbors who lived through it, there was no clean separation between before and after. The memories overlapped. The past couldn't be rewritten, but it couldn't be remembered the same way either. Every ordinary moment now carried an echo of what had been hidden beside it. The illusion didn't fade slowly. It broke violently, all at once. And when it did, it left behind a quiet, unsettling understanding that the most frightening revelations aren't always about discovering something new. They were about realizing how long the truth existed right next to you, unnoticed. That is what truly shattered on Seymour Avenue. not just the silence, but the belief that normal life is enough to keep us safe. What makes this story linger long after the headlines fade and the details blur is not just what happened, but where it happened and how it was allowed to continue. Time doesn't dull it because the conditions that made it possible haven't disappeared. Seymour Avenue wasn't unique. That's the uncomfortable truth. It was ordinary, and that ordinariness is exactly why this story still matters. We often distance ourselves from horror as a form of protection. We tell ourselves that terrible things happen far away, in places unlike our own lives. We imagine isolated roads, abandoned buildings, darkness at the edge of society. But Seymour Avenue dismantles that comfort completely. The horror here didn't rely on distance. It relied on closeness. Houses stood side by side. Lives overlapped. Voices carried through walls. People shared space, routines, and familiarity. And yet, within that closeness, unimaginable suffering remained unseen. That forces us to confront a reality we'd rather avoid. Proximity does not equal awareness. Being near something does not mean knowing it. The true horror of this story is not secrecy in the dramatic sense. There were no hidden tunnels beneath forests, no remote compounds cut off from the world. The secrecy was mundane. It was built from routines, assumptions, and trust in normal life. It was built from the belief that what looks ordinary is ordinary. Normalcy became the disguise. That's what makes this case so disturbing. The house didn't look threatening. The street didn't feel dangerous. The man didn't appear monstrous. Everything fit neatly into expectations, and those expectations did the work of concealment. Nothing felt urgent enough to interrupt the flow of daily life. This story matters because it exposes how easily human beings rely on comfort over curiosity. We are wired to preserve a sense of safety, even if that safety is based on incomplete information. We explain away discomfort because acknowledging it would force us to act, and action carries risk, responsibility, and fear. So we rationalize, we minimize, we move on. How often do we ignore what feels uncomfortable simply because it's easier to do so? How many times have we dismissed a strange moment, a troubling sound, or an uneasy feeling because it didn't fit the version of reality we wanted to believe? These aren't questions meant to accuse. They're meant to reflect something deeply human. We all depend on the assumption that the world around us is mostly safe. Without that belief, everyday life becomes unbearable. But stories like this show us the cost of that assumption when it goes unchallenged. How well do we really know the people around us? We recognize faces. We exchange words. We share spaces. The familiarity is not understanding. Seeing someone every day does not mean knowing who they are or what they're capable of. The trust we place in routine is emotional, not factual. It's built on repetition, not truth. And repetition can lie. Seymour Avenue reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself with chaos or spectacle. Sometimes it survives by being quiet, consistent, and forgettable. Sometimes it hides not behind secrecy, but behind predictability. Behind the comfort of thinking, nothing has changed, so nothing is wrong. That belief is one of the most dangerous ones we hold. This story is not a call to suspicion or paranoia. It's not an argument for fear. It's a reminder of awareness, of listening a little longer to discomfort instead of immediately silencing it. Of understanding that normal life is not a guarantee of safety, only an appearance of it. Because the most unsettling realization of all is this: if something like this can exist within a crowded, lived-in neighborhood, then the line between safe and unsafe is thinner than we like to believe. The houses on Seymour Avenue still stand. Streets like it exist everywhere. Lights turn on in the evenings. Televisions glow behind curtains. Laughter drifts through windows. And most of the time, those sounds mean exactly what we think they mean: ordinary life unfolding. But sometimes they don't. And that's the quiet, lingering unease this story leaves behind. Not a scream, not a shock, just a subtle shift in how we see the familiar. A reminder that the scariest places aren't always hidden in the woods or marked by warning signs. Sometimes, the scariest houses are the ones with the lights on, the ones that look just like every other house, the ones sitting calmly, silently, right next door.